Today I'm here with Bhabha, and we are doing the second of our tutorials, which is all about asynchronous programming. And first of all, before we get to the asynchronous part, we're going to speak about synchronous programming. So synchronous programming is just a way for computers to do things one step at a time in the order that they are given the instructions. And so this is what we are mostly familiar with, and just to explain it, we have an example here, and I just have this on my VS Code as well. And in this example, we are defining three functions. The first one is called first task, and all it does is just logs this string here. This one is second task, it logs this string, and then this one is third task, it logs this string, and then after that we execute each function, starting with the first one, moving to second task, and then third task. And then if I just open this web page here just to show you, on our console, if I open the console, yes, if I open the console, as you can see, there's nothing. Why is there nothing there? Oh, there it is. As you can see, the three functions are executed, and it just tells us that this is synchronous. Basically, it's in order of when we asked the program to run it, right? And then if I move on to the second part of the code, the second example here we have, let me just comment this out. So in the second example, we have this function right here, some long running function, that's what it's called. And in this function, as you can see, we create a date object for the time now, today's date and time. And basically we are saying that if this date object subtracted by the start is less than 5,000 milliseconds, I think it's milliseconds, so that's 5 seconds, it must, so basically what that's saying is that for the first 5 seconds it's not going to do anything. As you can see, inside this while loop we have nothing here, it's just a comment. And then after 5 seconds it's just going to return hello, right? And then it's gonna log to our console the string starting, and then we're gonna create a variable called result, and this variable is gonna store this function right here, and then it's gonna log it to the console. And after logging the function, after calling and logging the function, we are going to log to our console finishing, right? So remember, this is still synchronous programming, and in our console this will look like this. Let me just refresh. As you can see, it says starting, it waits 5 seconds, and then after 5 seconds it says hello and finishing. But you saw that it actually didn't go to line 37 before finishing this, so we had to wait because it's synchronous. It first logged this to the console, it first ran this line, and then it tried running this, but we had to wait 5 seconds for it to run this, and then this was only done after this was ran, right? So that's how synchronous programming works, right? So now we're going to get into the asynchronous part. Let me just comment this out. So now we're going to get into the asynchronous programming part. So asynchronous programming is just a way for a computer program to handle multiple tasks simultaneously rather than executing them one after the other, as we've seen, right? So there's a diagram here to explain how these things might work. So we have another example here. I'm just gonna comment it out, and in this example, as you can see, we are going to log to our console this string here, start of script, and then we have a set timeout here, and then in the set timeout we first run the function to log this string here, but only after 2 seconds. It's gonna wait 2 seconds, and then it's gonna log the string, and then after that we're going to log the end of script string, right? So what that's gonna look like when I refresh, as you can see, after 2 seconds it logs this. So as you can see, it happened asynchronously, it didn't happen in order. This happened first, this line ran first, and then it went to this line because this was still waiting 2 seconds to log to the console, right? And then when this was done, instead of it being logged second, it was logged third, it was logged the last, because this is happening asynchronously, it's not happening in order, right? So if I just move on, now we're going to go into our callback functions, right? So in our callback functions, I have this example here, and in this example, as you can see, we declare a function and just comment it out. We declare a function, the name of the function is fetch data, and then it takes in the callback function as a parameter, and then inside of that function we have the set timeout method again, and then we run the function where we run an anonymous function where we create a variable called data, and it's an object with the name of John and age of 30, and then we use the callback function here, passing in data as a argument, and then we wait 3 seconds to do all of that, right? And then after that we are going to execute function with a callback. As you can see, we call our fetch data function here, and in our fetch data function we pass in the function, this is just the callback function, right? And we pass in data as a parameter, because remember here we passed in a function. Yep, it's a function, right? And then we log data, and then after that we're going to log that data is being fetched, right? So on our browser, what that's gonna look like is this. It's gonna say data is being fetched, it's gonna wait 3 seconds, and then it's gonna give us the data, right? It's gonna log the data, right? As you can see here in this example, we have a function called fetch data that uses set timeout method to simulate an asynchronous operation, and then it took a callback function as an argument. The callback function was then passed the data retrieved by the function after the timeout had been completed, right? So now the set timeout method was used to execute the callback after a specified time. In this case it was 3 seconds, and then the callback was executed asynchronously, which means that the program did not wait, it continued to execute the next line of code without waiting for the timeout here to complete, right? And we saw what that looked like on the browser. So I'm just gonna comment this out again to keep things neat, and then we're gonna move on to this next part here, which is callback hell. As you can see, there's the pyramid of doom here, and you can actually see a pyramid here, like from lines 70 to 79. There's like an actual pyramid that resembles this one. So apparently this is not a good thing, right? This happens when you chain multiple callbacks together, one after the other, and it creates a pyramid just like I showed, and this is called callback hell, also known as the pyramid of doom. As you can see, this is the callback hell. Let me just uncomment it. As you can see, this is similar to what we have here, and then in this example we have the get data function, right, which takes a callback as an argument, right? We have get data here, takes the callback as an argument, and it's only executed after the data is received, and then the callback function then takes the data and calls get more data function, which takes a callback function as an argument, and then another get even more data function is there, which takes a callback, and then you see it goes on and on and on and on, right, until we log final data here. So what that means is that on our console, right, okay, so it's not going to work on our console because we didn't like define it. This is just to give an idea of what this nesting of callbacks can be like to make our code difficult to maintain. And this indentation here, basically the reason why I didn't go into details to make it work is because this is just inefficient. This is a very bad way of writing your code, right? It makes it very difficult to maintain, and it makes it even harder to see what's going on. Like I get confused going through this, like yeah, you see on line 74, that's when we're actually logging something to the console, but so many things happen before we get to that, right? So now apparently according to this, what we can do to avoid callback hell is that we can use a more modern way of handling asynchronous operations, which is known as promises. So promises provide a more elegant way of handling the asynchronous flow of a program, and compared to callback functions like we have here, so it helps us avoid getting into callback hell, and that's what we're going to be focusing on next. So let me just remove this right here. And then we're gonna move on to promises. So how do promises work? So a promise represents a way of handling asynchronous operations in a more organized way. So it serves the same purpose as a callback, but it offers additional capabilities and it's much more readable. So a promise in JavaScript is a placeholder for a future value or action. By creating a promise, we are telling JavaScript, the JavaScript engine, to promise to perform a specific action and only notify us after it's actually done processing that, or if it fails, right? So as you can see, this is us asking the JavaScript engine to make a promise, and this is the JavaScript engine making the promise, probably returning it or not, we don't know. So when it comes to creating a promise, right, we have to create a new instant of the promise by calling the promise constructor. So this constructor takes a single argument, which is a function called the executor, and the executor function is called immediately when the promise is created, and it takes two arguments, a resolve and a reject function. And what those do is that it basically handles what's going to happen if the promise is completed, the operation we're trying to do is completed, and then the reject just handles what happens if there is a failure, right? So now we're going to move on to the next part of our code. As you can see here, we give an example of how to create a new promise. As you can see here, we initialize the promise, we put it in a variable called myPromise, we created a new constructor, we passed it a function that takes resolve and reject, and as you can see, it's just an empty function that does nothing. And we log it to the console, and then on our console, as you can see, we have a promise here, it's pending and it's undefined because there's nothing inside of it, right? So now we're gonna get deeper into, basically this is the same thing that I just showed. We're gonna get deeper into promises. Now what we're going to do is that we are going to set up a promise that's going to resolve a string that's printed to the console after 2 seconds, right? So I'm just gonna comment this out so it doesn't mess with the next part of what we're gonna do, and we're just gonna create this promise again, right? We created this promise, but this time it's not empty. It actually has something for resolving, right? And I'm just gonna comment this out too, just to log it to the console so we have something to see, right? As you can see, if I go to my console and I refresh, so I think it's gonna wait 2 seconds before it does anything. Okay, it's not doing anything, but it does exist. I don't know why it's not showing the string.
Just refresh your browser while your console is open. Then let's wait.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, thank you. So as you can see, the promise was fulfilled. It tells us here the state, and then the result of the promise is hello from the promise. Thank you, Bhabha, that helped. And then but what happens, as you can see here, it's underlined. We do not have we don't have any logic to handle what happens if this fails. This works because this is a very simple thing. We just passed in the string if it does resolve, right? And so moving on to the next part, we are going to talk about how to consume a promise, right? So when consuming a promise, we have to deal with these 3 steps, right? The first one is to obtain a reference to the promise. So what this means is that to consume a promise, we first need to obtain a reference to it, and that's based on the code from the previous section. As we saw, our reference to a promise will be this myPromise. It's going to be this myPromise variable that we created here. And then the second step will be to attach callbacks to the promise, because once we have the reference, we can attach a callback function by using .then. So let me just uncomment this out so I can show you on my IDE as we work. As you can see right here, we use our, okay, it's uncommented. As you can see right here, we use this variable, the myPromise variable, as a reference to, okay, I think I'm gonna need to leave this uncommented too, right? We use this as a reference to this promise that we created here, but this time, instead of just printing the string, what we're going to do is that we are going to attach callbacks to the promise. So the first of our callbacks is going to be .then, right? And we have another thing called a catch method, right? So what these do is that the dot then method is called when a promise is fulfilled, and then the catch method is called when a promise is rejected, right? So the third step would then to be to wait for the promise to be fulfilled or rejected, and once we've attached callbacks to the promise, we can wait for it to be either fulfilled or rejected, right? And as you can see, there's an example here which is just the same thing as this. And if I go to our web page, as you can see, when I refresh this, as you can see the promise, right? And then that's when this callback here is actually executed, right? It prints the string, because remember here we told it that if it is resolved, resolved, we are supposed to print the string. We're supposed to log the results to the console, and there, as you can see, there it is, right? And then moving on to the next part, now we're going to be talking about how we are going to chain promises, right? So chaining promises is just creating a pattern that's going to allow us to have a clear and easy to understand approach to handling these asynchronous operations, right? So the pattern is going to involve connecting multiple promises in a sequence where the output of one is passed as an input to the next promise, right? And this linking, what it's going to do is it's going to be achieved using the then method that we just saw, and it's going to, as we said, it's going to be a callback function, and it's going to take that function as an argument, and then it's going to return a new promise, right? And then the new promise is then resolved with the value returned by the callback function, right? So we are able to just keep chaining these promises, right? And that's just a better way of chaining things compared to this pyramid of doom that we have here, right? So I'm just gonna uncomment here to showcase what I'm talking about. As you can see, we call on, we reference. Let me just uncomment this for now, as you can see. And then as you can see here, we reference the myPromise variable, the object that we just created here, the promise object we created, and we use these methods, the dot then, the dot catch, and the dot finally. So what the dot then, we've already explained this, that this is going to be executed if it's resolved, and then this is going to be executed if it fails, and then the dot finally, what it's going to do is that it will be executed regardless of what happens, right? So this will be executed. So as you can see in the dot finally method, what we have is the string that will say, that says I will be executed anyway, right? So what that looks like in our console is this, right? We have the promise right here, we wait 2 seconds, and the promise is resolved, right? So we log to the console the string that we passed in here, if you remember. There it is, and then finally works, is executed regardless of the status of the promise, right? Whether it's fulfilled or rejected, and as you can see, it's executed. It tells us I will be executed anyway, right? And then now we are going to move to error handling, right? So error handling deals with when a promise is rejected, right? So when a promise is rejected, as we already explained, it's going to execute this dot catch method, right? And it takes a single argument, which is the error that is thrown when it's rejected, right? So as you can see, we have an example here where we are fetching something from a link, right? So I'm just gonna uncomment this. As you can see in our example, we are fetching something from a link, this link right here, and then after we fetch it, we are going to take whatever we get. If it is resolved, right, if it is fulfilled, we're going to take whatever we get from this link, whatever we fetched, and we're just going to pass that, we're going to convert that into JSON, right? We're just going to pass that into JSON format, and then after that we're going to say, we're going to give another, we're going to create more logic to say what happens if it is resolved. We're going to take the data that we get, and then we're going to process that data using the process data function that we have here. And then after that, we're going to take that process data, right, and we're going to do something with it. In this case, we're not going to do much. We're just going to print the string data is processed, right? And then if this doesn't work, what's going to happen is that we are going to go into our error handling, right, where we're going to have the dot catch method, right? And what it's going to do is that it's going to log to our console the error that we get, right? So what that's going to look like on our browser, is this. Okay, so let me clean this up and just remove the first few parts. Let me just comment this out and then comment this out again. Right, so we are getting a few errors here. Okay, so when we go to our browser, as you can see right here, we are having a lot of errors. So the first of the errors here is basically we are blocked from fetching anything from this website right here, as you can see, because of a CORS policy. Right, so what that means is that the fetch failed, right, and we didn't even get to the next part of our this block of code right here, right? So what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to showcase a different part, right, and then we're just going to continue with this, right, where we use a different URL, right? As you can see, we fetch from this. Let me just format the document. Yep, looks better now. And as you can see, we fetch no longer from example.com, from a different URL now. And then as you can see, it's the same thing as what we did before. We have this method here, the then method, which basically just takes the response that we get, converts it into JSON, takes the data, processes that data, right? And then we take that data that is processed and then we log the processed data, right? And then if there's an error, we're going to log to our console that there is an error. And as you can see here, there was no error. We actually logged to our console the processed data. Okay, so now we will be moving on to the next part, which will be dealing about the promise, which will be going through the promise all method, right? So with the promise all method, what's happening is that instead of taking one promise, right, we actually take in an array of promises as input and then return a single promise that is either fulfilled when everything, so all of the promises in our array are fulfilled, or it just returns an error if maybe if all of them are, if not, if let me just get my words right, if they are not all fulfilled, then it's gonna return an error, right? So this is useful when we want to wait for multiple promises to be resolved before taking an action, right? So we're just gonna move on to the following example here. As you can see, we have created 3 promises, right? And I'm just gonna uncomment this. As you can see, we have created 3 promises here, promise 1, 2, and 3, right? And they each fetch from these URLs, it's 3 different URLs, right? And then after doing all of that, we're gonna use the promise all method, right, which is this one here. As you can see, the syntax is promise.all, and then we pass in an array of all the promises that we've created here. So promise 1, 2, and 3, as you can see, they're an array. And then we have the then method to deal with to deal with the callback, right? As you can see, we are fetching, and as you can see, when we are getting these, we're going to get the values, and what we are going to do is log these values if the promise is fulfilled. And as you can see, sorry, I need to comment this out so it doesn't disturb what we're doing now. As you can see, the values are printed out. As you can see, it's the first value, a response, second value is another response, third value is a response. As you can see, these are the responses that we get, right? And then we're going to move on now to using the fetch API with promises. I'm just going to comment this out. And then as you can see that we have already been using the fetch API for some of the examples that we've been dealing with so far. And what we're going to do now is just explain it in a bit more detail, right? So the fetch API is just a built-in JavaScript feature that's going to allow us to make network requests, right? So like things like fetching data from a server, and it's just a modern alternative to what existed before, an older XML HTTP request API, and it's designed to be easier and more powerful, right? So we have an example here where we are fetching some API from this URL right here, and then after using the fetch method to make the request to the server located at this URL, we are going to return the value as a promise that would be fulfilled with the server's response, and then we're going to use the then method to call the then method to consume the promise and extract the JSON data from the response, as you can see, as you can see here. And then after that, we're going to use another then method, right? We're going to call it to log the extracted data to the console, and then we're going to use the error handling here, the catch method, that if there's an error, it's just going to print error, right? And so we get into our console. For some reason things are not working. As you can see, because there was an error, it didn't work. There was an error. Our catch method caught that and it just returned the error here. As you can see, error colon gives us the error, right? So that explains error handling a bit more, right? And then now we are going to go into asynchronous functions with using async and await, right? So these two things, async and await, are features that allow us to write asynchronous code in a more synchronous, readable way. So async is just a keyword that's used to declare a function as asynchronous, and then await is a keyword that is used inside of the async function, right, to pause the execution of the function until a promise is resolved, right? So we use this when we want to wait. When running the function. We want to wait until it's resolved before we do anything else, right? So as you can see here, I've created an asynchronous function using the async keyword, right? And the name of the function is get data, and inside, as you can see, we created two variables called response and data. As you can see, both of them use the await keyword, right? So the first one is just going to wait until the promise is resolved, right? And the promise, as you can see, we are fetching data from this URL right here, right? We are making a network request. And then the second one, as you can see, is just formatting and extracting the JSON from the response that we get from that request. And then thirdly, we are going to log the data to the console, and then I just call our get data function, and then I have to comment this out, and then let's just see what that gives us on our browser. As you can see, we made a network request using the fetch method to this URL right here, and then we waited to do all of these things. And you see, when I refresh, it actually takes time before it does this. It waits for the promise to be resolved first before it basically follows through with the rest of the function. So that is it for the second of our tutorials, asynchronous programming. My name was Lucky and I was driving today, and Bhabha was my navigator. Thank you.